Do you know what the big trends are going to be for 2025 when it comes to houseplants? Stick around with me and let's dive into that a bit more. Hi, my name is Memo, this is my channel Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me, it's tropical houseplants. So today I want to talk trends, and I know this might not be a video for everybody, I get it. But stick with me, it's going to be more of a discussion-y type video. I'll show you a few plants around my space and let's dive into the trends that at least I think, and I'm hoping you might give your opinions down below as well, in case I miss any, in case you disagree with me, in terms of what I think the trends are going to be from 2025, based on what I've seen in the last 6 months to 12 months of like 2024 really. So the first big thing that I was going to suggest is probably going to be an ongoing trend, at least, if not for the entirety of 2025, for at least the early parts of 2025, because it's been going on for a while, is the kind of return, and this is, oh, why am I blocking again? This is a Gesneria, that's why I'm showing you, because this is kind of related to the African violets. And I know all the hate that I got from all the people that I was dissing the African violets as much as I did. It was just for me, that I didn't get on with them, but I know a lot of people do. But I cannot remember, I'll put the name at the top, and I don't have a label for this. But this is doing quite well, obviously you can see that it is doing really, really well. I want to say Pelischia, it's not a Pelischia. It is, oh, can't remember now. They will come to me. But the trend that I think is going to be big, at least for the earlier part of 2025, because it had already started in 2024, is the kind of repopularization of kind of old school plants. I don't mean geriatric plants, but I just mean old school plants. I think we're going to see a lot more of the epipremnums become prevalent again. More of the kind of Gesneriads that have been grown for years. Things like the standard green Monstera deliciosa is probably going to have a bit of a resurgence. I'm seeing a lot more people kind of enjoying their Ficus elasticus again. It's that kind of throwback to the 70s and 80s and the kind of plants that were big there. So I think we are going to see a bit more of that coming up. Now, let's look into that a bit more. Why do I think this? And I think it's going to be because people have known and loved these plants for decades. They might be coming back into fashion in the sense that they are kind of easy. I think for a lot of us that have been doing this for a while, whether it's us that are changing the way that we're doing things and going for some of these kind of more old school plants, or whether or not it's friends and family who have heard us whinge and moan about all of these prima donna type plants that need all of this extra work. Need is a strong word right here, because it might be need, but it might also be our need for our own mental health to care for them probably a bit more than we need to. Are we okay to all kind of agree on that? Good. But it is, if you'd imagine somebody's always complaining, you hear somebody and they're just like, not complaining, but you know, whinging. You would kind of whinge a bit about kind of going, oh, you know what, I'm having to deal with this, and it starts becoming a bit of a chore sometimes for some things. But that is what people are picking up, and they're just like, oh, I don't want to deal with that. But you know what? This Gesneria, this Pothos, this Monstera, it's been growing for years and it's doing fine, and I can see other friends who have basically forgotten it and it's doing well. For those people, guess what we've just done? We've just made it absolutely clear to them, and it's just like, don't try any of these. Stick with the ones that have done well. And to be fair, these are the fighters. These are the ones that are here decades later, and they're still growing strong, and they are in people's houses where they forget them and they have it as background decoration. They're still there years later. They deserve their place. I know they might not be for everybody, and I know that if you've got specific collections and all of these things, it might not be for you, but actually, you know what? I have found, for me personally, grabbing a few ZZ plants, grabbing a few pothos and putting them in places in my house where I just want a bit of greenery and I cannot grow any of these types of plants around, has been great. And I think a lot more people are getting there. I think not just the people that are not kind of houseplant collectors, but the kind of average Joe, they'll go for these plants and they'll go for them time and time again just because they're easy. Makes sense, doesn't it, really? Do you agree or do you disagree with me? Let me know down below. The next one is going to be more of an environmental type trend, I think, that we're going to see. And there's going to be two of these, so I'll start off with the first one. Do I think that we're maybe going to see a few more specific types of plants based on climate change? And the easy answer to that is yes. I've got two prime examples here. ZZ plant and a Sansevieria. I might put the Sansevieria down because it's very, very heavy. Let me grab it again whilst it kind of wobbles around in the pot. These plants, and you see it flopping around, it needs to be kind of rooted in a bit more, but this one had a bit of root rot, so I'm going to put it down so I don't want to move it around too much. It's a very old plant at this point and I kind of want it to survive, but it's currently regrowing all of its roots. So let me hold up a standard ZZ, a green ZZ plant, and explain a bit more why I think this trend is going to become a thing. I've seen it already starting, to be fair. And these types of plants, so possibly a pothos, possibly, and it's kind of looking at the hardcore plants that we were looking at before that have been here for decades. The ZZ maybe not so much, but some of these more heat tolerant, drought tolerant, obscene amount of light tolerant type plants, I think they're going to have a bit of a resurgence, not just in the next year, but as we kind of progress through the years, because these are plants that you can just kind of pop in a space and they can get beat down by light. Believe it or not, ZZ can do really well in bright and direct light. It's not just a low light plant. It can survive in low light better than most, and by survive it just means it's dying slower than everything else, because everything a ZZ does is slow. But it's that hardiness that these plants will have that will be okay with going dry for long periods of time. They'll be okay with the humidity levels in a house being horribly bad, whether or not it's the winter because the winters are getting colder and wetter and you're running the heating for a lot longer. Is it because also things are getting more expensive, but all of these things are happening at the same time, whether you're getting colder winters and they need to be able to deal with cold more so than some of these plants might be dealing with it. And the kind of obscenely bright summers that we're getting now in relation to what they were even 5 or 10 years ago. I do think these plants are going to really kind of establish their space within our collections, within our homes, because they can survive all of that, if that makes sense. Some of these plants are going to become harder to care for and more expensive in the long run to care for them, because if you think about, I'll give you a quick example of what I do in my space in the different seasons, just quickly so you can understand kind of costs and all of these things to kind of keep them happy. So starting from the summer months, I definitely need to have some form of cover, possibly an even stronger cover than I have now. So I've used that paint, I might use the shade cloth, I might use a very, very dark shade cloth. Because even in the UK, last summer was a bad example, we are getting very hot and sunny days that never used to be. I mean, a couple of years back, for the people that live in the UK, do you remember that horrendous heat wave? Because the heat wave over here for a lot of people from warm countries are just like, it's not a heat wave until you've survived a heat wave in like a UK type heat wave in the UK. You cannot judge on how low those temperatures are in relation to what we're used to in the warmer countries. But experiencing a 40 degrees Celsius heat wave in this country was nowhere near the same as a heat wave that is 40 degrees back home in Greece. Really wasn't. It was a whole different level of hell here. But they need, like, that's what I mean, global warming, things like that might be becoming more of a norm. So having plants that could deal with that is important. Now, in this space, as I said, just shade cloth, I've got multiple fans running in the summer. I've got a dehumidifier running in here. Granted, I know it's not for everybody, but because I have too much humidity in here, I have all the windows open, I have all of these things, and like, this costs money. This costs money, it takes time to keep all of these plants growing, but also not dying because they're experiencing something that is an extreme, basically. Flip that to the winter. There's always an electric heater just below me here that's always running. The heating is always running to keep this space warm enough because the winters are getting colder. The fans are still going, all of these things. So it kind of adds on. Whilst if you can get something that is just hardy and will survive all of these things regardless, it will survive the cold, it will survive the heat, it will survive too much light, it will survive the dry air. I think we're going to start seeing these plants really, really take center stage because they're just fighters and they can survive those horrendous environments. Now the second part of that equation, and I've still got the plants here in front of me, but it's going to be things more along the lines of these types of plants, the type of plants that we've got kind of growing that are tropical plants. And that is more about the environmental impact of the hobby, so to speak. So there's things like, and I even did this on my wish list video that is coming out today, whilst after I'm filming this, but I know what's in it because obviously I filmed it. And I talked about a plant, and I cannot remember, and I will add the name there, which is a beautiful plant. But looking into it a bit more when I was doing the editing, I then realized that yes, it's a beautiful plant, but I think it's endangered in nature because of its habitat being kind of encroached on as much as it is by humans, really. So there is that element. There's also the point where not a lot of people talk about things like poaching. All of these things are a problem that we all need to start addressing a bit more significantly at the moment. The benefit, I will say, of the houseplant hobby becoming less popular, because let's call a spade, it's nowhere near the stupid popularity levels that it had in the pandemic, mainly because a lot of people were trying to make a quick buck, understandably, because they'd maybe have lost jobs and they needed a steady stream of income, and we saw those prices rise to the levels that they did, and this is bringing me on to another trend that we'll talk about in just a second. But we also saw a huge push for the new big thing, for the new thing that nobody's seen, all of these things. And basically what it meant is these plants, if they weren't already in cultivation, if they weren't somewhere in kind of a grower's polytunnel or wherever in some of these more tropical locations, guess where they were getting these plants from? They were ripping them out of nature, and that's never a good thing. That's never a good thing. Think about it on a very quintessential level, that a plant that nobody had heard of or was even talking about, even serious collectors that have been collecting for decades before we all got involved, had never seen or heard of these plants before. And all of a sudden you are getting fully mature specimens. Come on now. Come on now. How would the grower have thought, oh yeah, this plant is going to become popular in about 5 years' time. Let's get it and start growing it so it can get to a huge size so I can sell it for an obscene amount of money. There you go. There's a mature version of this plant that nobody had spoken about or even was aware of until 5 minutes ago. Where do you think they're coming from? So we need, and I think more people have become more cognizant of this. As I said, the good thing is there's less of that crazy urge to get as much of that as possible. The reality is, because of that crazy urge, it has meant that a lot more growers, whether or not they poached to begin with, I don't know, and I couldn't claim, but there's a lot more interesting plants that they all pulled and started growing, probably for, I'm hoping, my humanity is hoping that they got small cuttings or things like that and didn't remove whole plants, big mature plants from nature, but that they had some of these plants and they started growing them. I think Kaylee Ellen mentioned this a couple of years back on her channel as well. You don't know what the growers have already got growing there and they're holding back. So there's always this thing where the growers are probably picking up some of these things and just kind of going, okay, there was a boom, so this has become a lot bigger than it ever has been before. Let's get some new things and get them to a size that in a couple of years' time, when this plant does its debut onto the market, we can then have it ready. So for example, things, and I'll bring up the ZZ again, the ZZ Raven, and there's so many different cultivars, I want to say, of a plant that is, so there's different variegations and colors of all these things that that has been in cultivation, and it would have to have been in cultivation for a while, because this plant grows really slowly, even with things like tissue culture. I don't even know if ZZs have ever been tissue cultured. Probably have, I'm guessing. It takes a while to get them to a size where they are sellable. So you're not selling somebody, here's a leaf with a bit of a tuber and some roots down below. Enjoy. Here's your house plant. But yeah, so it takes a while. So hopefully that part is kind of like sorting out the equation a bit more. There are some very cool individuals. One that comes to mind because me and him have been talking over the years. He's an amazing individual, more so focused on the Hoyas when he had his own collection. Some of you the UK might have already heard it. I think it's, I'll put the name at the top. I think it's Botanical Otter, who's now kind of moved into the field of conservation and a bit more kind of that natural habitat of some of these houseplants, and is now somewhere in the Far East. I can't remember the country. Is it Malaysia, Indonesia? I'm not entirely sure. I might be entirely wrong, but I'll put the Instagram handle at the top. Go and give him a follow. Amazing individual, and he constantly shares updates from there, basically. And it just helps us all to have that front of mind, help support these individuals that are on the front line to make sure that poaching is reduced or stamped out entirely, and see what people are doing in order to counteract that, because that's the least that we can do in order to kind of keep things going. The other thing I will say is you also need to remember with things like poaching, it's very easy for people to go into frenzies online at the moment and just kind of going, this has been poached and this has been poached and look at all these images. I'm just like, yeah, but where did you get those images from? Like, how will you know that it's from that seller or not from another? It's really tricky when we're all trying to pay policemen and we're all stomping our feet down and just going, this is unacceptable. Where's the proof? Where's the real proof? So that's the bit that's difficult. So, and you also need to remember, like, things like what you're kind of dealing with possibly could have also been thrown out by one of the competing companies. Just kind of say, look, I'm gonna just drop this right here and give you the hint that it might have been poaching. Yes, and guess what happens? That one competitor has just destroyed the other person's business because everybody has gone into a hoard mentality and have gone absolutely crazy. So all I'm saying is pinch of salt, use your critical thinking and judge accordingly. If you're unsure, reach out to the seller and ask them the question. Be blunt, ask them the question. But these are good questions to be asking. It means that you care. Don't go into a hoard mentality of kicking people when they're down if they haven't done anything, because anything they say at that point, in the wonderful word of the internet, is wrong. So bear that in mind. But yes, conservation and the idea of kind of being aware of things like poaching, natural habitat loss, these are important things. Now, coming into the trend of rare and unusual plants. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about what I think that is turning into, at least in terms of the trend currently. You could disagree with me down below, or you can agree with me, or you can expand. We all have our own opinions for this one. So I'm showing you, I think this is, every time, Magnificum crossed with Luxurians Anthurium. The first thing that I've seen already happening, and I think it's going to continue in 2025, is the prevalence of hybrids, not just Anthurium hybrids, across the board. So philodendron hybrids, things that we never thought were going to be a thing are now becoming a thing. I think we're going to see more of that coming onto the market. And there is a certain point as well where people that might be doing tissue culture, they find, I don't necessarily find, but it can be quite easy to get variegation occurring, because the way that tissue culture works, you're creating hundreds, possibly thousands of little versions of that plant. And eventually, if you're doing it at that scale, you'll get natural mutation, which would be the variegation in this case. But those will be things that we'll see coming up as rare and unusual and expensive. And we're seeing this already, like a lot of the more kind of expensive things at the moment tend to be variegation based, or possibly hybridizations. So I'll give you an example of this. So was it the Monstera White Monster or Ghost Monster? I can't remember which one it is. It's the Monstera that's like almost entirely white. That was one, and I don't know whether or not that started off, I don't think it did, from things like a tissue culture, but that is a very specific type of variegation, and it's not very widespread, and it hasn't become widespread because the prices are still really, really expensive. Are they going to come down quickly? I don't think, because remember we were talking about before the craziness that happened during the pandemic. That also meant huge interest, huge purchasing power, brought the prices down really quickly. What we probably aren't seeing at the moment with some of these really, really, really expensive plants now is that drop down to kind of more affordable mass market prices is going to take a bit longer to happen than what it did in the pandemic. Makes sense. It's a kind of it's based on what happens a lot of the times with economics. But things like hybrids. Hybrids are something that they're not on the market in a plentiful form, because unless one or two specific growers have hybridized this, you're not going to see it come up, and unless you've done it yourself. So I'm thinking of, and I can't pick up my Zara X Michelle, the Doc Block hybrids. That becomes a thing as well, where it's just like that's been happening over decades, if I'm not mistaken, to get to some of these plants. Some of these things as well, like unless you've had a Magnificum and unless you've had a Luxurians, and you did the cross to hybridize them, this is something that they can charge a bit more, because it's just like, well, there's only so much, there's only so many growers that have grown this specific hybrid. If you want it, it's going to cost you X. So there is that. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because remember we were talking about before about kind of the concept of deforestation, the concept of poaching. Hybrids, a lot of them, probably not all of them, but a lot of the hybrids are happening, they're man-made hybrids, which means that they're not taking, at least the hybrids are not coming out of nature. Can't claim as to where the parent plants might be coming from. Usually it probably wouldn't be, but so slightly more ethical, I guess. So hybrids are going to be a thing that I think are definitely going to be big. I will link up the top, or actually give you the URL on Instagram of an amazing individual, I think, if I'm not mistaken, called Captain Aroid. If you're not following already, go and check it out. Hello, amazing hybrids. And if I'm not mistaken, he either works or owns a bit of a plant nursery, and he's always sharing some really cool hybrids, things that I would have never heard of before. A lot of like philodendron hybrids, obviously a lot of anthurium hybrids. Very, 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 very cool. But yeah, those are the plants that are still costing, if that makes sense. Some of these maybe variegated plants that are happening from tissue culture accidentally, but they're there and they're created. Again, I'll bring up the example of the ZZ. I didn't even know until somebody like Captain Aroid had shared about all the different kind of color variants of a ZZ. I just thought it was the green one, the raven one, and maybe the variegated one. But I'm just like, there's a whole slew of colors that I did not know existed, but do exist, and obviously they can charge money for that. Those types of kind of rare plants are a bit more unusual, and to be fair, it's a tricky one with that one, because again, coming back to that weirdness of the word rare, because they're not necessarily rare in nature, but some of these plants that might be variegated plants that are happening through tissue culture, or plants that are hybridized, might almost deserve the word rare given to them, because by default they kind of are. They're rare in the sense that because humans have been involved in how they are created, either through that tissue culture kind of weird mutation that might generate that variegation and then grown from there, or even the hybridization, again, depending on how deeply hybridized it is as well, because if you look at some of the Doc Block hybrids for anthuriums, you're looking at hybrids being crossed with other hybrids at some point as well. So there is that. They are a bit more rare, at least in my head, because there's only so many of them, because there's only that individual or that group of individuals that has ever grown them. So by default, they will be there. And I don't think it's always necessarily, at least with these types of plants, that they're holding back to keep the prices up. Some of the times it will be that as well. But a lot of the times with this is a hybrid needs to get to a certain size in order for you to sell it, or at least get it to a certain size in order for you to show people what the mature form of that hybrid looks like, so they can all start drooling and salivating. and wanted, and then you can sell seedlings and kind of say, okay, this might not look as impressive as the mature plant, but get this because it is a seedling of that hybrid, and this is what it could potentially grow into. Same thing with the variegated. The variegated plants are going to be slower, especially if they've happened through natural mutation that is happening during the process of something like tissue culture. There's only so many of them, and they do need to get to a certain size in order for the people to sell them, so I get the prices at that point. And I'll finish off on price. I'll finish off on the bit of like where I think the trend is going to be in terms of prices and what has been happening for a while. So, correct me if you think I'm talking rubbish with this one, but we have seen prices of plants, I'm thinking things like the Spiritus Sancti, the Monstera obliqua Peru, all of these quintessentially super rare and difficult plants to get a hold of that used to cost thousands to buy, you can now purchase relatively cheaply. I mean, I can give you a specific example. I went to the usual garden centre that I was telling you. Granted, it does have some interesting things in there, but I saw seedlings of a Queen Anthurium in my local garden centre. Granted, they weren't cheap, like they were quite small seedlings for about 20 Great British pounds, but that's in my local garden centre, here in the middle of nowhere in the UK. So they've become a lot more popularised, and actually what used to be rare has now become a bit more mass market, dare I say it. So, and it does make sense. Again, I hate this example, but it makes sense if you kind of look at it. The new big TV comes, or like, I'll give you, I remember when 3D TVs came out, or 4K TVs came out, and there was only a handful of them, and they were extortionately priced. So there was only a handful of people that purchased them. But then the more people that purchased and purchased and purchased and purchased, they brought down those prices, and now both of those technologies for TVs are pretty much standard. I don't even know if there's any TVs that are being sold as 3D TVs anymore, but 4K TVs are nowhere near as expensive now as what they used to be. Same thing happens with plants. These prices will all eventually come down. Even some of the plants that I was talking about before, the hybrids, the variegated ones that are coming up from things like the tissue culture process, they will eventually come down. The difference that I'm talking about in terms of price is that might take a bit longer, what I mentioned before. It might take a bit longer for it to get down to that level because there isn't as many people involved, fortunately and unfortunately at the same time, within this hobby as there would have been during the pandemic. We all saw that huge spike that happened. And if you're one of the people that are still around, hey, we're still here. It's great. But it is one of those things. Do I think that's a good thing at this point as well? I don't want to sound exclusionary, and this is probably the usual thing that anybody that online, I don't want to sound exclusionary, but it has become a case of now that there's people that don't need to make that quick buck anymore. There's a lot more people now that are in it for the love of the plants rather than to make some quick money. So it generally means that we're all appreciating our plants a bit more. Really. Like, I'm buying this plant not because it's an expensive plant and I can propagate it and make some money. Some people are still doing that on occasion just to supplement a bit of income, but nowhere near to the levels of the pandemic. Now it's just like, I'm buying it because I love it. It looks really cool. I want this plant, yeah? Which is, I think, a healthier place to be. We can't sniff at what happened during the pandemic and judge it too much because it gave us a lot more of these plants and availability, because all of a sudden something that was a kind of dying industry, houseplants weren't really that big before they started coming back into popularity, it was kind of plodding along. It suddenly had a surge, so people invested time and money into it. So it's been good for us. That we need to look at the silver lining on all that. But the reality is, yeah, I think the prices will stay low. Some of the plants that we were able to never find before are going to get probably even cheaper. But there's still that notion of new things and exciting things coming out all the time because, again, we've all said this before, this is like Pokemon, you need to collect them all. So there is that kind of notion that comes with it, for good or for bad. But yeah, I think as a whole, prices are a lot more stable. They'll remain stable. I'll still think that they're going to be going down, with that slight exception that we were talking about before, the hybrids, some of those variegated plants that are kind of rare in their truer form, as in they're not rare in nature because they wouldn't necessarily occur in nature, but they're rare in the sense that there's only so many of them that could be created. It's very similar to, how am I going to describe that? So it's very similar to something like a piece of jewelry could be quite rare because the only person that can make that one specific type of jewelry is somebody who is sitting there doing it all by hand, and there's only one individual. By default, that is rare because that is the only source of that jewelry. Same thing with these plants. That is the only source. It will be more rare. It will be more expensive until more people do the same thing. But yes, I think I've prattled on for far too long with this one. What do you think when it comes to the trends? Did I miss something that's glaringly obvious? I probably have. To be fair, it's me. So I probably missed something that's been kind of like really obvious. But yeah, as I said, that environmental element of buying based on how the environment is shifting, the more kind of awareness of poaching and ecological kind of disasters that are happening around where some of our plants would be naturally growing, the resurgence of a type of rare plant and the prices kind of stabilizing and staying low with a few exceptions, I think are going to be the big things for this year, as well as those kind of old school kind of hardy plants that have been around for decades and people still want them in their collections just because it's easy. I think those are the big ones for me this year. Let me know your thoughts. It might be that you're seeing something that I'm not seeing, and the interesting thing, and I think this is something that a lot of us, myself and a lot of you actually appreciate in the comments, is that some of these trends are different in different countries. Don't ever forget that a lot of the times when we were all focusing on aroids in kind of like the northern hemisphere, a lot of people in the kind of like Asian countries weren't so much focusing on these types of plants because potentially they might be growing all around them outside, so they kind of, it's nothing special for them, but they're focusing on things like succulents. So the point I'm trying to make is, let me know what you think or what you're seeing the trends be like in your part of the world. And that, I think that will be quite interesting for us all to have that conversation down below, because it's just like, oh, this is what's happening in the UK, but actually you're based in Canada, or you're based in the States, or you're based in, I don't know, like the Caribbean. And these are the things that you're seeing that's happening. I think it's really, really cool because it can be very region specific as well. But yes. Anyway, I shall let you enjoy the rest of your day. So hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon. And I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.